This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
When the game tips off, the NBA action is just beginning on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because FanDuel is your home for NBA live betting. However you want to play, now is the perfect time to join. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. 21 plus and present in Virginia. First online, real money wager only. $5 first deposit required. Bonus issued is non-withdrawable bonus bets which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock and the Pavilion, with me, your host, Stephen Wallace. 50 years ago, England were blown away in the Ashes by the sheer pace of Dennis Lillee and Jeff Thomson. That 1974-75 series didn't just crush England, it changed Test cricket forever. As the saying goes, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, if Lillee don't get you, Thommo must. Today I'm joined by David Tossell, author of Blood on the Tracks, to look back at a series that left its mark on the game. Hello, David. Thanks for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion.
My pleasure.
And today we're going to be talking about your latest book, Blood on the Tracks, the 1974-75 Ashes series featuring Jeff Thomson and Dennis Lillee.
Yes, the fearsome twosome. Quite a dynamic duo, weren't they?
They certainly were. And you're about the same age as me, so we've got similar memories, although you've probably got even better memories having done this book about the 1974-75 series.
Yeah, and that was probably the starting point for the book, really. It was the first Ashes tour I have vivid memories of. I remember a little bit about 70-71, but 74-5, I was approaching 13 years old, and there was coverage on the radio in the morning. Started at 6:30. You only got about half an hour or so, unless they were playing in Perth, which was a bonus. You used to get an extra couple of hours because of the time difference. So I remember setting my alarm to wake up and hear the horror stories of what was happening overnight. And then it was the first time we'd had highlights of an Ashes series in colour, and that just seemed kind of otherworldly, really. You know, it was even to the extent where it was the first time we'd seen England playing abroad and seeing their MCC jumpers with the yellow and red trim. So it kind of just seemed much more vivid somehow. And the other thing about those half-hour highlights, it meant that all you really saw was the wickets and the near misses and our boys being hit all over the body with all kinds of sort of vicious looking deliveries. So it was a very vivid experience, given that the relatively little amount of coverage there was. So that was, for me, the starting point. It was a very sort of personal experience, I guess. And obviously it was a series that sort of resonated for many different reasons that I'm sure we'll come into.
We certainly will. The radio coverage, I remember, it sounded like they were playing on the moon.
Yeah, and I just remember sitting at 6:30 and, obviously you didn't know what happened during the night. And I remember desperately hoping that the first thing I was going to hear was, the name. The first thing you always listen for, isn't it, when you just switch on, is to hear which batsmen are at the crease. And you always used to hope it was, you were going to hear, Edrich and Fletcher or something, but you normally ended up with, Hendrick and Willis or something, because we'd lost so many wickets. And you got the horror stories of what had been happening. And it was like listening to dispatches from a war zone a lot of the time rather than cricket. And I just remember that sinking feeling whenever you realised how things were going, how badly things were going. There was you remember this because you're the same age as me. That nightly program Nationwide that used to be on sort of current affairs program on BBC, and they had a guy called Richard Stilgo who used to do little sort of amusing little tunes that were relevant to current affairs, and he did one on it, and he started, if I remember it rightly, it was every morning from Australia. No, every morning on the radio, the news comes from Australia. England's batsmen once again have had a ghastly failure. And that just kind of encapsulated it for me, because it was exactly that, turning on the radio in the morning, hoping against hope things had gone well, and finding out they hadn't.
I guess then you came to write this book because it's 50 years since the tour.
Yeah, it seemed like the right time. It's one of those ideas that have been kicking around in my head for a while. And I thought, right, if I'm going to do it, this is the time to do it, the 50th anniversary. So, yeah, that's what gave me the final push to go on and do it.
And how did you come up with the title, Blood on the Tracks?
The title was suggested by a friend of mine, who's edited quite a few of my books. And I'm not a Bob Dylan fan, but he I guess is, and he mentioned that he'd often thought about. He writes books as well. He'd often thought about this tour, and had even had a title for it. So when I told him that I was doing it, he said, "Well, go on then. As a present, you can have the title if you want it. The Blood on the Tracks." It's sort of it kind of captures the essence of it, I guess. And Bob Dylan released Blood on the Tracks, the album, while the series was going on, just a few days after the Ashes had actually been lost, and Australia had won them back. So it seemed appropriate. I mean, there wasn't literally blood on the tracks, I guess, but it seemed to kind of encapsulate what the real sort of storyline of the series was. So that's why I went ahead with it.
And Bob Willis, who was a massive Bob Dylan fan, was playing for England.
Exactly, yeah, and even put Dylan in his name, hadn't he? So probably one of the few people in that English dressing room that was actually eager for that date of that album release coming out.
Well, we're going to look at the series now, particularly through the deeds, really, of Dennis Lillee and Jeff Thomson. Just for a bit of factual information, Dennis Lillee was 25 at the time, Jeff Thomson 24. Lillee had played 11 tests, and Jeff Thomson had only played one test match against Pakistan in 1972. But Lillee hadn't played since he had a career-threatening injury, and he hadn't played a test match since February 1973.
That's right. And he'd missed, he hadn't bowled at all in the Australian summer of 73, 74. He ended up, I guess it was the days when there were sort of fairly primitive surgery options around, but he ended up spending several weeks in plaster from basically neck to his hip. They felt that the only way they could solve it was either an operation that no one wanted to do, or just completely immobilize him for several weeks. So that's the route they went. They completely immobilized him. Then he had a period of just basically running. He played a little bit of club cricket in 73-4, but didn't bowl. He just sort of played as a batsman. So going into 74-5, going into the season, there really was no real idea of how he was going to perform. If anything, the expectation was going to be that he would be nowhere near the force that he'd been during the 1972 Ashes in England, when he'd sort of exploded onto the scene, really, sort of, wild hair, arms flailing all over the place when he ran up to bowl, extremely quickly. So no one really knew what to expect. England, actually, the MCC tourists had a glimpse of him when they first arrived in Australia, because Western Australia were playing a game in Adelaide, where MCC were practicing ahead of their first game, and they saw him bowling basically at medium pace. And a lot of the newspapers, especially something like the Daily Mirror, which is a tabloid, was always going to sort of take an extreme view of everything, basically said, Lillee's clearly finished. He's a medium pacer. We haven't got anything to worry about. And then on the other end, you had Jeff Thomson, who, as you said, had played one match, taken, I think, 0 for about 100. Had actually had a broken foot at the time, which he hadn't revealed to anyone. But then 73-4, he not really played any first class cricket either, because he couldn't get into the New South Wales team. He only started playing first class cricket again properly when Greg Chappell got him to sign for Queensland. Now, Chappell had seen a bit of him in grade cricket, knew that he was wild and fast, and Chappell's view was that I don't want to have to risk facing this guy. I'm going to get him to sign for Queensland and have him on our side. But there was no real sense of what a force he was going to be. So, England really, not saying they were complacent, but they went into that series without any real fears about either Lillee or Thomson.
So England held the Ashes and were confident.
They were, and funnily enough, any talk there'd been about a possible bouncer war before the series had kind of been with the angle that it might be England who started it, because John Snow, 4 years previously, had bowled very quickly and often, quite short and quite intimidatory in his style, and had really sort of blown the Australians away. And so naturally the talk was, are England going to do it again? With the big difference this time that Jon Snow hadn't been selected. He'd not gone on tour since that 70-71 series. The powers that be, in their wisdom, chiefly Gubby Allen of the MCC at this particular selection meeting, said that he wasn't the right stuff. They didn't want him on tour, even though Mike Dennis, as captain, desperately wanted him. So there was no real sense that a bouncer war was going to ensue, and certainly not that Australia would be the ones who would be instigating it.
England also went on tour without their leading batsman Geoffrey Boycott, who your book says was selected for the tour.
He was originally selected. He opted out of Test cricket most of the summer of '74 for various reasons. He felt he was off form. He was having some sort of personal issues, but everyone thought he was going to be coming back. He allowed himself to be selected. He never sent his acceptance letter back, which is the way you had to do things. The letter dropped through the post, and you had to formally accept your invitation. So a couple of weeks had gone on since the squad had been announced, and the England selectors figured out, well, we better actually talk to Boycott and find out what's going on. Bedser went to see him, Alec Bedser, the chairman of selectors, and Boycott said that he decided not to go on tour. There were many reasons. He, as I say, he felt he was out of form. His mother, who he was very close to and lived with, had been not in the best of health. He had a lot of commitments with his benefit year at Yorkshire. And underlying all of that was the fact that he didn't really rate Mike Dennis as a captain. And I think the other issues were stuff that he could have put up with if it hadn't been for the fact that he was going to have to go on tour under Mike Dennis. He toured under Dennis in '73, '74 in the West Indies. And ironically, it had probably been Boycott's runs in the final test of that series, which ended up as a victory for England, which saved the series, gave him a 1-1 draw in the series, which probably kept Dennis in the job. Had they lost that series, Dennis might not have still been captain in 1974, and therefore wouldn't have been in position to go on the tour. So, ironically, Boycott kind of kept him in his job, and Boycott, I don't think, wanted to tour under him again. So he pulled out. They selected Brian Luckhurst. Again, you could argue that was a fairly odd selection. They picked him basically on the basis that he'd done well in '70-71, which is kind of ironic when you think that Jon Snow, who'd done so well in '70-71, wasn't selected. They used that tour as the criteria for selecting Luckhurst. Ian Chappell, who I spoke to, said that the Australians just couldn't believe a selection like that. They said in a time like that, Australia would always look at a newcomer and kind of look to the future, whereas England always looked to the past when it came to stuff like that. So Luckhurst went on tour as well. So they went basically without the two men that had won in the '70-71 series, Boycott and Snow.
And your book reveals they didn't go with many people in total, did they? Not like today.
No, they only went with basically three backroom staff. Alec Bedser, who was the chairman of selectors, who was tour manager, which was kind of a figurehead role. It was the guy making the speeches at the functions and that kind of stuff. Alan Smith, AC Smith, was assistant manager. Wasn't really the role of coach. He would sort of organise nets, but that basically meant that there was making sure there was a bucket of balls there for people to bowl, and he would bowl a few himself, but it wasn't really a coaching role. And then they had the physiotherapist Bernard Thomas, and then they picked up over in Australia. They picked up J.E. Sanders, who was the scorer and also sort of doubled as kit man as well. So it was a small team, certainly nothing like today. And it meant that there wasn't really anyone there to help players when things did start going wrong. It was really down to the players to work things out for themselves. There was no one there really in a coaching role that could kind of help them out of the hole that they found themselves in.
And it started going wrong from the first test at Brisbane, which began on the 29th of November. Not so much on the first day, but they certainly got a shock on day two.
Yeah, I mean, even before that, you could say it had gone wrong. Dennis had been very ill on the plane over, and it took a few weeks before he was really in the best of health. David Lloyd broke a finger in fielding practice before the first test, so he couldn't be considered. But yeah, the first day England did okay, restricted Australia to what was a manageable score. The Australian tail then got a few runs, and then England batted. Tony Greig did very well. Scored a magnificent 100. Was sort of taking on Lillee and Thomson by cutting them over the slips, driving them through the covers, and signalling his own boundaries. But before Greig had got going, there'd been some signs. Thomson had sort of come out to bowl very quickly, bowled that horrible just short of a length, and had that slingy action like a javelin thrower that meant the ball was sort of leaping up at throat high from just short of a length. So it was a bit of a shock for the England batsmen, and the top order didn't fare very well. Greig came in, got his 100, and I guess sort of papered over the cracks a little bit. And then in the second innings, Thomson just sort of blitzed through them. Got, I think, a sixfer in the second innings. And suddenly England realised what they were up against. And not only was Thomson getting wickets, but he was, hitting people painful blows as well. Dennis Amiss and John Edrich both took painful blows from Lillee and Thomson, and it was clear that this was not going to be quite what they'd expected. Ross Edwards said that you could see the England's batsmen's eyes sort of opening in sort of shock and horror at what was happening, and he described it as cricket beyond anyone's experience, because it was very clear that this was going to be a pretty relentless attack, and that both Thomson and Lillee were going to offer the kind of test of courage as much as anything else that England batsmen hadn't foreseen when they'd gone into the series.
Because the wicket at Brisbane wasn't a good wicket.
Wasn't great. Clem Jones, who was the mayor of Brisbane, was also the self-appointed groundsman. He fired the groundsman at the Gabba. He felt he wasn't doing a good enough job and did it himself. There's a lovely story from David Lloyd. He said they first sighted the Gabba. There was this guy in a pith helmet and shorts, was on his knees, sort of scrubbing around in the mud, trying to create a wicket from somewhere. And then they turned up at a civic reception that night, and there's the same guy with the big chain on, and it turns out he's the mayor of Brisbane. So,
not what you expect.
The best qualified man in the world to prepare a test wicket. But in the end, the wicket wasn't too bad. Chappell thought it was good enough to bat first on, and it wasn't really the wicket's fault that England lost in the way they did, and it wasn't the wicket's fault that the balls are flying around in the manner that they did. It really was the way that they were being bowled by Lillee and Thomson.
This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. Underwear drawers are like the Wild West. You never know what you're going to pull out or what shape it's in. So upgrade your collection with the buttery soft comfort of MeUndies. MeUndies' signature fabric is as soft as a warm hug from your favorite sweater. Plus, it's breathable and oh so comfy, making it ideal for all-day wear. Get 20% off your first order, plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/Spotify with code Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify, code Spotify.
Hair thinning can happen for so many reasons. Whether it's stress or hormones or anything, at Nutrafol we've learned that real change starts below the surface. Our hair growth supplements take a whole body approach and target the key root causes of hair thinning, so you can see visibly thicker, stronger hair in 3 to 6 months.
Hair growth starts from the inside at Nutrafol.com. That's Nutrafol.com.
You might not be a tech genius, but you want your business to crush it, and you need a website now. Thankfully, Bluehost makes it easy. Customized, optimized, and monetized. Everything exactly how you want with AI. Your site can be up within minutes. You really won't believe it. Plus, Bluehost keeps you protected 24/7. No more worrying about hackers. Just relax and focus on your customers. So whatever your hustle may be, secure your online presence in 2025 with Bluehost. Head to Bluehost.com to start now.
They were certainly flying around in the next test at Perth, which at the Wacker, probably the fastest wicket in the world. But the story was before that test match, really, with England calling up a replacement.
Yeah, good old Colin Cowdrey, at nearly 42 years old. It was actually the eve of the final day of the first test. Lloyd, as we mentioned, had already had a broken finger. They weren't quite sure how long he would be out for. Edrich had been hit. At this point, Dennis Amiss hadn't suffered the broken thumb that he was about to suffer. But even then, it was clear that England had probably needed another batsman. They only had basically 6 batsmen for the top 5 places, so there wasn't an awful lot of room if anyone got injured, and if they were potentially 2 or 3 batsmen down, they needed someone. Now, they talked. The batsmen sat around and they talked, and the general feeling amongst most of them was that they needed someone with experience. More people plumped for Basil D'Oliveira than Colin Cowdrey. But in the end, the Kent connection with Dennis being Kent captain and Cowdrey, former Kent captain, it was Cowdrey who Dennis got on the phone to and apparently said, you've probably seen the highlights of what's going on. Do you fancy coming and joining us? And to which Cowdrey replied, yes, I'd absolutely love to. And Dennis apparently said to him, well, I don't think you're going to love it, but, you're welcome anyway. And the thought was when he got on the plane that he would probably be cover. He wouldn't necessarily have to play. When it became clear that he was going to play, everyone thought he was probably going to go in at number 6. And Cowdrey said it was only on the morning of the match itself. They tossed up. England were going to be batting. They'd been put in. That Dennis went up to him and said, how do you fancy going in at number 3? Which seems remarkable. A man of nearly 42, he'd been on his couch in Kent a couple of weeks earlier, straight off the plane, no practice match. Lillee Thomson clearly firing on all cylinders. There you go, going at number 3. Talk about in at the deep end.
Yeah, he would have only seen what us as teenagers would have seen on the TV and heard a bit on the radio. And he was, as you say, nearly 42, going on his 6th tour of Australia. Yes,
yeah. I mean, he at least had seen enough to know that he packed his bag with a lot of extra padding. He'd got his wife to sew some sort of foam padding into shirts. And there's description of him walking out looking like the Michelin Man, and people just couldn't believe. Tony Gregg said he opened his case and all this sort of foam just sort of popped out like a sort of child's toy or something. So yeah, sort of fairly unlikely figure. But that first test match he played, he stood up very well. He was the only one, I think, in that, I'm right in saying, in that first test he played, he was the only one who didn't fall to Lillee Thomson. I think it was Max Walker who got him out, or he was certainly the only one that wasn't caught in the slips, which was just how most people were getting out. Showed a lot of bravery, pretty strokeless, probably didn't play a lot of shots, but he was just sort of nudging and nerdling and deflecting, and got a great reception. There was a lot of goodwill towards him. I think everyone wanted to see him do well. Certainly no one wanted to see him get hurt, which is what a lot of people feared. So it was a brave performance. Probably not the kindest thing for him to have put him in that situation. There was never any real prospect of him going out there and scoring hundreds. And you could argue that maybe, a more left field pick, throwing in a Derek Randall or someone like that, you never know what might have happened, which is what England would do now. We saw in this last winter, Jacob Bethel's batting at number 3 at age 21, half the age of Colin Cowdrey, and Bethel having virtually played no first-class cricket. And England's going back to a man, as you say, who'd been on 5 previous tours.
Yeah, I don't think Brendan McCullum, I'm trying to think who would now be that old to actually get called up for England. But just to put Cowdery into perspective, sixth tour, his first tour was the Tyson tour in 54, 55. That really does date him, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. 20 years ago, effectively playing in a whole different generation of cricket.
And in the first innings, Cowdery scored 22, and I looked up, he batted 125 minutes on the fastest wicket in the world against Lillee Thomson. And in the second innings, he opened the batting.
Yeah, things as we said just kind of went from bad to worse. Brian Luckhurst got hit, couldn't open the batting in the second innings. It meant that within the space of a test and a half, I think about four of the England batsmen got broken bones and had blows that had either meant they missed tests or had to drop down the order or retire hurt. It was remarkable at how quickly things sort of started to go pear-shaped. So, Cowdery, again, why is Cowdery the man who's got to open? Dennis had previously been an opener earlier in his career, but was out of form. Even Fred Titmus, who was on the tour, he'd been Jeff Boycott's first opening partner in Test cricket. But I guess, Cowdery was the man they thought was the best option. And Cowdery sort of fearlessly really went out and faced the music and got 41, which was his best innings of the series. And again, you couldn't fault him for bravery, but it was only ever really a sort of a sticking plaster, really. It wasn't really going to be a long-term solution.
England lost the Test match by 9 wickets. Australia scoring 23 in their second innings. So it shows how big a hammering it was. You've been talking about injuries. I've also heard Dennis Amiss call it headline rather than bodyline.
Yeah, I think that he said that was what Len Hutton had said. He said, well, forget about bodyline. This is headline, because it was. After 2 tests, it got to the stage where it was clear that this was, a clear tactic that Australia were going to use, particularly Lillee. Lillee bowling bouncers, trying to intimidate the England batsmen. Thomson, as we said earlier, didn't have to bowl bouncers to threaten England in the same way. You could get the ball to lift off just short of a length, and you watch the highlights. Almost every wicket seemed to be an England batsman jabbing his bat out at a ball that, maybe he could have left alone, but he wasn't sure if it was coming at his throat or not. The footwork was all over the place. And as we said earlier, there was no one out there to kind of take a step back, and certainly no video analysis in those days for anyone to say, look, this is what's going wrong. This is maybe what you need to try and do. All they could do was get AC Smith to bowl at them off of 18 paces in the nets in the hope that would sort of replicate a little bit of what they were facing, but clearly didn't. And so they really sort of trying to figure it out by themselves. As I said, the bowling was sort of, slightly intimidatory in nature. There was a sense of maybe the umpires should have stepped in by now. Lillee particularly, liked to bowl the bouncer. Thomson's bouncer wasn't so much of an issue. If Thomson bowled a bouncer, because of the nature of his action, it normally meant the ball went well over head height. You didn't have to worry too much about it. It was that short of a length delivery you had to worry about with Thomson. So heading into Melbourne for the Boxing Day test, there was no real expectation that England were going to do very much.
Because Thomson had quite a short run-up.
Short, shuffling run-up, no real sense of what was going to happen until he actually got to the crease. And what made him so dangerous was he had this sort of slingy action, which meant not only did his arm come over extremely quickly, it meant that the ball was hidden from view till the last minute. He didn't have that sort of gather that someone like Lillee had. Even though Lillee was bowling very fast, you could see the ball in his hand as he went into his gather. You could follow it through to the point of release, whereas Thomson, you didn't see the ball at all until that action of moment of release when it came out from behind his shoulder. So it made it much more difficult to pick up the length of the ball and made him your much more threatening opponent, both from the point of view of losing your wicket and being hit a very painful blow.
Moving on then to the Boxing Day test at the MCG, very close game that England could have won.
Yes, indeed. And so could Australia. All four innings were within sort of 3 or 4 runs of each other. England could perhaps have won had Dennis been a little bit more aggressive in his captaincy on the final day. Used the spinners a bit more than he did, maybe set slightly more aggressive fields. There's a lot of speculation and conjecture that maybe had Dennis been in better form himself and been in a sort of better, more positive frame of mind, that maybe he might have tried to push home a little bit more. And don't forget, England, really were in a position as 2-0 down. They needed to get a win from somewhere very quickly. But by the same token, Australia could have won. They batted very slowly once it got to the last hour. Rodney Marsh and Max Walker were happy just to kind of knock the ball back and play out maiden after maiden when they could have really have gone for it. Knowing that had they gone 3-0 up in the series with 3 to play, that was, almost was curtains. But I guess at 2-0 up, I guess the feeling was that was good enough after 3 tests, if that was the way it ended up. And they were happy to take the draw and go on to Sydney.
It was a very highly charged atmosphere at Sydney, especially on the hill.
Sydney was probably where it reached the sort of peak of bitterness, if you like. I mean, Ian Wooldridge went out for the Daily Mail and covered that test. He hadn't been at any of the previous test matches, I don't think, and he said it really was like walking into a war zone. He was astonished at how bitter the whole thing was, and the level of sort of hatred, if you like. And you got the fans on the hill chanting "kill, kill, kill" as the bowlers came into bowl. Dennis Lillee got warned for intimidatory bowling, I think, on 4 out of the 5 days. It was the time when the umpires finally thought, okay, I think we've got to do something and step in here. But, the Australian batsmen were complaining as well. Jeff Arnold got into a bit of a spat with Ashley Mallett, bowling short at him. It was just very bad-tempered all round. And England lost the test match and lost the series. Batted poorly, to be honest. They came within only, I think, 15 minutes or so of saving the test match. And bizarrely on the last day, you had things like Tony Greig charging down the wicket to Ashley Mallett and getting stumped. And I think things like that were the result of facing Thomson and Lillee and knowing that there was so little on offer there, that when you did face a Doug Walters with his medium paces or an Ashley Mallett, people were so desperate to get on with it and sort of try and get runs while they could, that it made them more likely to make mistakes against those bowlers. But England really should have drawn that game. But as I say, they lost it, and 3-0 down with 2 to play. That was the Ashes gone.
This was the test when Keith Fletcher got struck on the head, really, on the cap.
Yeah, there were some nasty blows in that test. John Edricks got one on the ribs that he didn't realise it at the time, but it broke his ribs. They weren't sure. It wasn't until an X-ray much later, but Mike Dennis said that you could almost see the indentation in his ribs when he took his shirt off in the dressing room. Fletcher got hit one on the head. Fortunately for him, it got him right on the badge, on the cap. And England in those days, when they toured, they wore the MCC badge with the St George and the Dragon. So it's quite a sort of hefty piece of artwork, if you like, and probably saved him. Jeff Arnold got one that almost cleaned him up and came very close to doing serious damage. And that, I think even Dennis Lillee got a bit frightened by the thought of what that ball that he bowled might have done to him. So yeah, it was a fairly unpleasant experience all round.
It shouldn't be forgotten. I know this is 50 years ago, that the little protection that the England players had, and in those days, really until this series, tail end batsmen weren't subjected to short pitch bowling.
No, there was that unwritten rule that you didn't bowl bouncers at tail enders. Now Dennis Lillee will sort of probably conveniently tell you that it was Tony Greig who started the whole thing off, because in the very first innings, back at Brisbane, Lillee had been batting with Max Walker, and the England bowlers had been pitching the ball quite well up. They'd been letting them sort of play their forward defensives, and Tony Greig had been going, come on, give him something short. Lever said he might, and he didn't. And Greig got the ball, and he said, well, to hell with this. If anyone's going to do it, I'm going to do it myself, and got Dennis Lillee out with a bouncer that Lillee gloved down the leg side, and Lillee came off fuming, throwing his bat around and saying, look, don't forget who started this, but we're going to effing finish it. So Lillee will always tell you that the short pitch bowling at the tail enders was actually started by Tony Greig at him, but I think that's a sort of a slightly convenient excuse, if you like. I think that the short pitch bowling was going to come in whatever happened. But there were some sort of nasty near misses for the tail enders.
Because these are the days without double thigh pads, chest protectors were unheard of. Obviously no helmets. Gloves weren't as good.
No, and you could tell that by the number of injuries that there were to people's hands, people breaking fingers and thumbs. And yeah, there was no headgear. It was the first time really that the players during the tour actually did start sitting around and saying, do you know what, we could do with some head protection here. I mean, it's bizarre really when you think about it, that the most dangerous blow that you could receive was on the head, and it was the last piece of the body to really get protection. As I said, Fletcher was lucky that one that hits him on the head got him right on the badge, which was the only sort of additional padding you had probably on the head at that time. So yeah, it was remarkable really when you look at the nature of the test and the bowling and the number of batsmen that did get hit, that there weren't more serious blows to the head.
What I wasn't aware of was that the England hero in the 70-71 series, John Snow, was commentating. Yeah,
and there was some talk at some point, of whether they should get him out of the commentary box. I think it was after the second test. The England players sat around and they went to Alec Bedser and they said, look, this is crazy. John Snow is here. He's up in the commentary box. We need someone who can give back a little bit to what the Australians are giving us. Bob Willis was the only real genuinely fast bowler, but he was, at that stage of his career when he was having a lot of problems with his knees, he was never very fit for very long. And so there was a serious discussion among the players, at least, about whether they could have John Snow selected. But Alec Bedser said, look, that ship has sailed. We had long discussions about Snow in the selection meeting. I'm not going to go back to Lords and ask John Snow to get selected because I know what the answer will be. But certainly the players wanted him from the very word go. I mean, Chris Old said that the thing with John Snow was that he didn't like doing it in the state matches. He wanted to save himself for the test matches, and people didn't like that. A lot, the people in management didn't think that was the way to go about it. Whereas Old said that the other seamers would happily have done all the John Snow's bowling in the state matches, just keep him fresh for the test matches. That would have helped them as well. It would have made them more dangerous, knowing that they had John Snow at one end. But no, Snow stayed in the commentary box, which was, you're right, it's kind of deeply ironic, really.
The other major story, a player who wasn't playing in the fourth test at Sydney, was the England captain, Mike Dennis.
Yes, of course. Yeah, Dennis famously dropped himself. He got no runs at all in the first three test matches. He more than anyone was struggling with the fast bowling. I mean, you look at his dismissals in the first three tests, and his feet were going in one direction, his bat and his head were going in different directions. He really was all over the place. So he took the decision to drop himself. There's two ways of looking at it. You can either say that's a very brave decision, or you can say that maybe he was taking the easy way out. It's certainly not a decision that Ian Chappell comprehend. I mean, Chappell probably famously the last captain who would ever have taken himself out of the firing line. He would have stood there whatever was going on. But Dennis decided that he shouldn't be there. It would be better for, ironically, he'd made the decision that it was better for Keith Fletcher to be in the team. Now, Fletcher hadn't been making runs either. If there'd been a load of batsmen scoring runs and Dennis had been the only one not to, then maybe you could understand the argument. But when no one had been getting any runs, it made it even more difficult to understand, in many people's eyes, Dennis's decision to stand down.
Next test, Adelaide, another heavy defeat by 163 runs, a test where Dennis Lillee got 8 wickets in the match.
Yes, by Sydney and Adelaide, Lillee was really back to his best. Even though he had bowled quickly in the first few tests, he himself admitted that it took him a while to get going. He was a little bit tentative, but by Sydney and then Adelaide, he really did feel he didn't have to worry about his back anymore. He could really let go. England got off to a great start in that test match. The wicket had been a little bit damp after the first day being washed out. Derek Underwood took the first 7 wickets to fall. Australia were in trouble. And then Terry Jenner, of all people, got a 60-odd and got them out of trouble. And then England's batting probably reached the absolute low point. Dennis Amiss was out for a pair. Lillee got in both times. And I think Richie Benaud said it was the most sort of abysmal performance of England batting he could ever remember.
Yes, at that point, after 5 test matches, England had failed to score 300 in any innings.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and interestingly, they were never blown out for 110. They always sort of had a couple of players who got 40s or 30s or 40s. And you felt that they might have had a chance, and then they would have a flurry of wickets and it would all go wrong. And Australia were consistent in their batting. They always had someone who came through and got centuries at the right time, or someone lower down the order would get runs, and they always seemed to be getting first innings leads of 150 or whatever, and the game was always in their control.
6 tests, they go back to Melbourne, England 4-0 down. There's no Jeff Thomson, who's got injured playing tennis.
Yeah, Thomson missed the second innings in Adelaide. Thomson always said that he could never do anything at half measures. If he was playing tennis or surfing or whatever, he had to give it his all. So on the rest day, this was still the days when they played 3 days and then had a rest day. On the rest day in Adelaide, he played tennis, gave it all on a serve and threw his shoulder out. So he had to miss the end of the Adelaide test, and then wasn't fit to play in Melbourne in the 6th test. Now, Lillee did play, but after a few overs was struggling with a bad foot, and he had to go off as well, which basically meant they were without Lillee and Thomson. Now, England always, it's very convenient to say, well, without Lillee and Thomson, it meant England won the game. But I think what gets overlooked in that test, it wasn't just a question of not having Lillee and Thomson. It was basically Australia were a bowler short. Now, if Lillee had known before the test match that his foot wasn't going to last, and they could have picked, say, an Alan Hurst and had him and Jeff Dimmock and Max Walker, I don't think England would have won the match in the way that they did. It was the fact that Doug Walters ends up as your third seamer and has to bowl an awful lot of overs. That was what really hurt Australia, and England were able to take advantage. Mike Dennis got a big 100, 188. Keith Fletcher got 100 as well. And suddenly, England were winning by an innings, which, had seemed unthinkable a few weeks ago.
Yeah, so what if there had been no Lillee and Thomson in 74, 75? And Lillee got 25 wickets, Thomson 33.
Yeah, it's interesting to know what would have happened. I think it would have been a closer series. Would England have won? I'm not sure. There were other Australian bowlers around. As we said, Hurst and Dimmock certainly weren't Thomson and Lillee. I think it probably would have been a close series. There's no doubt that Thomson and Lillee were the main difference But I think still, you look at Australia's batting with people like Ian Redpath, Ian Chappell, Greg Chappell, Doug Walters. I think Australia probably had, well, they certainly did have the edge in batting as well. I think Australia would have fancied themselves to have won the series even without Thomson and Lillee. They certainly wouldn't have won it as easily, and it certainly wouldn't have had the long-term impact that the series had if it hadn't been Thomson and Lillee playing what, as we said earlier, a kind of a different nature of Test cricket, and you could argue sort of changing Test cricket long term in the meantime.
Was it only really Tony Greig and Alan Knott who really came out with credit on the batting side?
It was. They were really, until Melbourne, they were the only two to have made hundreds. Edrich, as you would expect from John Edrich, anyone who saw him play knows that he was a very sort of nuggety player. I think he was only out for less than 40 odd once in the series. He managed to end up getting a couple of 40s and 50s and a 70 and a 30 odd not out, and he ended up averaging over 40 without ever really making a big sort of contribution that threatened to change the course of a match. So yeah, Knott and Greig, the only real two, came out with any real credit until Dennis and Fletcher got their centuries in the final test.
As the sleeve on your book reveals, Wisden said that never in the 98 years of Test cricket have batsmen been so grievously bruised and battered.
And I think that was true. It was the nature of it was different. Obviously, there'd been fast bowlers before. Body line had happened. Body line was I guess, a specific tactic, if you like, designed to combat one particular batsman, Don Bradman, and England obviously used it against all of the Australian batsmen. But there was a kind of a method to it, if you like, and there was a sort of a certain pragmatism about it, and it had a specific aim. This seemed a little bit more Wild West, if you like, in its nature. It was Thomson and Lillee terrorizing batsmen in a way that they'd openly spoken about before the series. Both of them had made comments about not being frightened about hitting batsmen and enjoying hitting batsmen, and if they couldn't get batsmen out, they were quite happy to hit them. And that was it was a harder edge to anything we'd seen before, and it just meant the cricket was of a slightly different nature, had a different personality, and a lot of players who the English batsmen who played in that series felt that they felt the personality of Test cricket changed after that. Well, West Indies went out a year later, and Clive Lloyd's team lost 5-1. Thomson and Lillee, in harness again, but being as equally dangerous as they had been in this series for the last time, as it turned out. And it made Clive Lloyd go away and realise that, fast bowling was the way to go for him. He not only did he have, two bowlers, like he had a whole battery of people that could bowl like that. So he took it to the next degree, if you like, and ended up with 4 fast bowlers. But if it hadn't been for Thomson and Lillee, maybe it would have taken him longer to come to that conclusion. The other thing that this Test series did, and that I think you certainly can make the case for it having changed the course of cricket, was it was the first time the Australian players themselves really, I think, got a sense of what they were worth. They saw massive crowds coming in, and they saw how little they were getting paid. There was a famous quote from one of the players that the guy who was operating the scoreboard at Sydney was getting paid more than Dennis Lillee was. And it was the first time they really realised that they had a commercial value. So when Kerry Packer came along a couple of years later and wanting to get TV rights and not getting them, and therefore deciding to take on the Australian authorities and set up his own series, the Australian players there were ripe for the picking, because they realised how badly they were being paid, and they realised how much better they could be treated by someone like Kerry Packer. So for various reasons, I think you can say that the nature of cricket changed after this series, and I think it wouldn't have done if it hadn't been for the presence of Thomson and Lillee.
No, just going back to the Thomson and Lillee angle, your book reveals a great quote when the England team are, believe it or not, flying off for a 2-test series against New Zealand after this 6 tests in Australia, when one of the players said, "Thank goodness we got out there alive."
There genuinely was that feeling. Mike Dennis said that he kind of looked around the plane and he spoke to players, and it really did feel like they were sort of one of those helicopters being evacuated from a hot zone in wartime, that they kind of got out of there with their lives. And as events, ironically, in New Zealand were to show, it would have been so easily for one of them to have got a nasty blow and suffered, life-threatening injuries, which, as we know, is exactly what happened in New Zealand when Peter Lever hit Ewan Chatfield, the New Zealand number 11. How ironic is it that the one big serious injury of the tour ended up being inflicted by an England bowler.
Thankfully, all was okay there with thanks to Bernard Thomas.
Bernard Thomas very quick on the scene and realised what was happening, that Ewan Chatfield, who'd been hit ducked into a Peter Lever bouncer, had swallowed his tongue, and Thomson was able to resuscitate him, get his tongue out, give him cardiac massage, and literally did save his life.
A lot of the England players, though, lasting effects for them as a result of this series.
Yeah, there definitely was a feeling of shell shock. A lot of the batsmen, well, they were certainly out. Their Test careers were almost over. I mean, Dennis was saved by the runs in Melbourne, and then got runs in New Zealand, and kept the captaincy for one Test in the summer, which seemed a bit of an odd thing. You either were going to give it to him or not. But they gave him, I guess they felt, because of the runs he'd scored, he deserved another chance. So he captained England in the World Cup, and then in the first Test, really to give himself a chance to fail, and so they could bring in Tony Greig. Dennis Amiss said that he never really sort of recovered for a couple of years from what had gone on. He did make a fantastic comeback in Test cricket in 76. He did play at the beginning of 75, but was out of the team fairly quickly. And then at the end of 76, came back against the West Indies with a completely revised technique, where he kind of stepped right back across his wicket before the ball was even bowled, and sort of nudged the ball to the leg side and drove it when he could, and got a double hundred against West Indies. When you think of what he'd suffered in Australia, that was a fantastically brave innings and a fantastic effort. But David Lloyd didn't play Test cricket again. Cowdrey obviously didn't. Edrich did. He kept going for a year or so. But there were a lot of people that really struggled after that series. Keith Fletcher played a little bit, came back as England captain. Fletcher, I think, after that was then a sort of specialist for when they were playing against India and touring against spinners. Wasn't tried against the West Indies in 76 because his technique against fast bowling had been found out. So, yeah, it changed a lot of people's careers.
Coming to the end then, David, you must have really enjoyed writing this book.
It was a fantastic experience. I did really enjoy it. It was an excuse to sit and watch what highlights are available of the series. Many years ago, I acquired some VHSs of the highlights of the daily highlights of the series, and I've still got an old VHS player, so I was able to sit and watch all those, as well as sort of scouring around on YouTube, interviewing several of the people that were involved. It was obviously hugely entertaining and enjoyable. Even just kind of painstakingly going through all the official scorebooks and sort of recreating them in linear form for the book as well, which I originally did just to kind of help myself get a flow of the day's play, but we ended up deciding that they might as well get published as well. Was really enjoyable. So I probably got a lot more enjoyment out of the series than some of the England batsmen did. Let's put it that way.
I'm sure you did that. What I liked also about the book, Blood on the Tracks, is the social history you told through the winter of 74, 75.
Yeah, I think it's important to set things in the proper context, both in terms of what was happening in England. It wasn't a happy time for the country. There was a lot of there was mainland terrorism, the IRA bombs going off all over the place. It was a time of high inflation, high unemployment, industrial unrest. It was a time when people were looking to something like an England Ashes tour to give them a bit of light relief. So when it didn't go like that, it kind of makes it even more painful, because we were sort of banking on Mike Dennis and his boys to sort of lighten the gloom a little bit. And also, I tried to bring in a little bit of what it meant to Australia as well, and Australians at that time. It was a time when Australian ties from the UK were being loosened, really. With the UK having joined the European Economic Community, the Common Market, in 1973, Australia realised that its bonds with England were becoming less. They were looking to other parts of the world as potential trade partners. The government of Gough Whitlam had come in and was trying to distance themselves a little bit from the UK, getting rid of the UK national anthem, the UK honours system. So England being beaten heavily by Australia sort of all tied into that, and it meant it was happening at a time when Australian pride and Australian nationalism was reaching a peak as well. So it meant that an England defeat in the Ashes was even more sort of more welcomed by people in Australia.
So concluding, the likes of Dennis Lillee and Jeff Thomson were the right people at the right time for Australia. Yeah,
they really sort of captured the mood, if you like. And the thing about Lillee and Thomson as well is they reflected the English, the Australian crowds as well, and people like Doug Waters and Ian Chappell did. They were the kind of people who, if they hadn't been out on the field playing the matches, they'd have been on the hill in the Sydney or Bay 13 at Melbourne, and they'd have been drinking their beers and chanting away with the rest of them. So they were a real reflection of the people that were going to watch them, and that's why even more so they were sort of so beloved by that Australian public at that time.
Thank you very much, David, for being on the Paddock and the Pavilion, sharing the stories of the 1974-75 Ashes series, which you can find in your book, Blood on the Tracks.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
O'Reilly. You need parts? O'Reilly Auto Parts has parts. Need them fast? We've got fast. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Product availability. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.